Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Bible, What Everyone Needs to Know by Michael Coogan, narrated by Jim Denison. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to figures and tables included in the print and ebook editions of the book. 1. Bible and Bibles. What is the Bible? The Bible is the sacred scripture of Judaism and Christianity. In its pages we encounter some of the most memorable characters in world literature: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Abraham and Sarah, Jacob, Moses, Samson and Delilah, David and Bathsheba, Job, Jesus and Paul. Some of the best-known religious texts: the Ten Commandments, the Shema, Psalm 23, and the Sermon on the Mount. And some of the most important concepts in theology: covenant, chosenness, sin, atonement, and salvation. Over the ages, the Bible has also had enormous influence on politics, on literature and the arts, and even on medicine and science. The word Bible basically means book. Although usually formatted as a single book, the Bible is actually a collection of shorter books written over the course of more than 1,000 years, an anthology of texts that Jews and Christians have considered especially authoritative, even inspired, holy writ. Put simply, for Jews, the Bible is a collection of some 24 books that by the 2nd century CE had a special status. For Christians, the Bible includes these books and some other Jewish religious writings, which together were eventually called the Old Testament. To them were added another 27 early Christian texts, known as the New Testament. Behind these simple definitions, however, lie many complexities, both because of the Bible's long history of formation and because of the different faith communities that consider it canonical. What is a canon, and why is it important? The technical term for authoritative scripture is canon, a word that comes from the Greek word for the cane plant, whose reeds were used as measuring sticks. A canon is thus originally a ruler, and thus in effect a rule. In the study of literature, a canon is a group of texts that have a special status, that are classics, as it were. In the study of religion, a canon is those sacred texts that have special authority for a community. A canon may be a group of texts whose components are not necessarily fixed, as in Hinduism and Buddhism, or, more narrowly, only those texts that religious authorities have recognized as authoritative sacred scripture, in other words, as canonical. But the Bible is not just one canon, but several that to some extent overlap. The processes that led to the formation of several biblical canons were complex and gradual, and are not fully documented. Although the basic shape of the Jewish canon was set by the 2nd century CE, there continued to be debates around the edges about whether some books should be dropped or others added. The same is true for the New Testament. The canonical status of a few of its books was debated, and other books that some groups considered canonical were eventually not included in it. By the late 4th century, a canon of 46 books in the Old Testament and 27 in the New Testament was the norm for Western Christianity, while several Eastern churches added one or more books to each. The term Bible then means different things to different religious communities. All of this is very complicated, but it is necessary to explain because, among other reasons, it shows that the Bible is a human creation. The books that comprise it and the order in which they occur were not sent down from heaven. What is the Bible in Judaism? In Jewish tradition, the Bible has 24 separate books, divided into 3 major parts. The first part, known as the Torah, the teaching or the law, consists of the 5 books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The second part, known as the prophets, Hebrew, Nevi'im, is further divided into the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, so called because they come first, and the latter prophets, the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the book of the 12 minor prophets, Hosea through Malachi. The third part, known as the writings, Hebrew, Ketuvim, contains books in many genres: Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth, Song of Songs, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. The earliest reference to these three divisions dates to the 2nd century BCE in the prologue to a work called The Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, which mentions the law and the prophets and the other books of our ancestors. In Hebrew, an acronym formed from the first letter of the names of the three parts is Tanakh or Tanakh, a frequent term for the Bible in Judaism. Of these three parts, the Torah was the first to be considered authoritative scripture. By the 5th century BCE, if not before, that teaching or law was in written form and was ascribed to Moses. Because of the narrative chronology of the books of the Torah, from creation to the death of Moses, their order never varies. The same is true for the former prophets, which continue the narrative from the death of Moses to the 6th century BCE. The order of the latter prophets is less stable. In most manuscripts, the three longest books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, usually occur in that order, which is chronological, but the order of the minor prophets in the Book of the 12 varies considerably. There is even more variation in the order of the books in the writings, which was the last part of the canon to be considered authoritative scripture. Not all groups within Judaism of the late Second Temple period, 1st century BCE to 1st century CE, agreed about the contents of the canon. The Samaritans considered only the Torah to be scripture. Other Jewish communities included in their canon books that religious authorities eventually rejected. For example, the Essenes at Qumran, a Jewish sect whose library was the Dead Sea Scrolls, seem to have considered the Book of Jubilees as scripture, but perhaps not the Book of Esther. It is clear, however, that the canon was largely established by the end of the 1st century CE. Different groups included other books, and the status of a few books was debated, but by the 2nd century, those debates were essentially over in mainstream Judaism. What are the Apocrypha? Several other important Jewish religious writings were eventually omitted from the developing canon. These books became known as the Apocrypha, a word meaning hidden books, although there was never anything hidden about them. Sometimes they are also called the deuterocanonical, belonging to a second canon, books. The word apocryphal, meaning of doubtful authenticity, comes from the name of this group of books. But despite the word's connotations, these are authentic Jewish religious texts. Some of the Apocrypha were originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic, but for the most part they were preserved in Greek. They include many genres. We find historical fiction in the books of Tobit and Judith, narrative history in the books of the Maccabees, wisdom literature in the Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, and additions to and revision of earlier biblical works such as 1st Esdras, the additions to Esther, and the additions to Daniel. They were written from about the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE. Fragments of several of the Apocrypha have been identified among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were part of the library of the Essenes at Qumran, and many are alluded to in the New Testament, suggesting that for some Jewish groups, including early Christians, they may have been considered canonical scripture. Yet although some of the Apocrypha continued to be quoted by rabbis and to be part of a kind of secondary canon in Jewish tradition, they were ultimately not included in the Tanakh because of their late date, or because they had not been written in the sacred languages of Hebrew or Aramaic. What are the pseudepigrapha? Pseudepigrapha is a term used by scholars for some of the many Jewish writings from the 3rd century BCE to well into the Common Era that are generally not considered authoritative scripture. The word pseudepigrapha means falsely attributed works, because many of the pseudepigrapha are attributed to major biblical characters, none of whom can plausibly be identified as their authors. Among the pseudepigrapha are works such as testaments, purported last words of such characters as Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and Job. Apocalypses, recounting revelations concerning the end of the world made to Adam, Elijah, and others. Expansions of biblical narratives such as Joseph and Asenath, refer to Genesis chapter 41 verse 50, Jubilees, and the martyrdom and ascension of Isaiah, and hymns, prayers, and wisdom literature attributed to various individuals. Some pseudepigrapha, such as Jubilees and First Enoch, are found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggesting that for the Essenes at least, they may have been canonical. New Testament writers also sometimes quote or allude to some of the pseudepigrapha as if they were canonical. For example, Jude verses 14 through 15 quotes 1 Enoch chapter 1 verse 9, and Jude verse 9 describes a conflict between the archangel Michael and the devil about Moses' body, probably a reference to a now lost ending of the Testament of Moses. What is the Bible in Christianity? By the early 2nd century CE, Jews had reached agreement on which books were their scriptures. In Christianity, the situation was and continues to be more complicated. The earliest Christians were Jews, and their scriptures were thus the same as those of other Jews. The versions or editions of those scriptures that the earliest Christian writers used, however, did not always correspond to what became the traditional text of the Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text. Writing in Greek, the authors of the books that eventually became the New Testament, and most other early Christian writers as well, usually quoted the Septuagint, the Greek translation and edition of the Tanakh, made beginning in the 3rd century BCE. For most books, this Greek edition corresponds to the Masoretic text, but there are some important differences, especially in books such as Jeremiah, Job, Daniel, and Esther. The Septuagint also eventually included the Apocrypha, which thus became part of the developing Christian canon. By the 4th century CE, Christians had rearranged the books of the Jewish scriptures. First came all the books identified as historical, those dealing with the past. So to the Torah, in Greek the Pentateuch, and the former prophets of the Tanakh were added the books of Ruth, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, now separated into 2 books, and Esther, along with some of the Apocrypha, Tobit, Judith, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. The second division of the Christian canon contains what are often called poetical and wisdom books, which can be viewed as having to do with life and worship in the present. Included in this division are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon, and, from the Apocrypha, the Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach. Last come the latter prophets of the Tanakh, understood as dealing with the future and strategically placed just before the New Testament, whose events they were believed to predict. After the book of Jeremiah was placed the book of Lamentations, because he was thought to be its author, and from the Apocrypha, the book of Baruch, attributed to the prophet Jeremiah's scribe, and the letter of Jeremiah. The book of Daniel was placed after Ezekiel, because Daniel was also identified as a prophet. What is the New Testament? Some of the growing body of early Christian literature also came to be considered authoritative, so Christians developed a major addition to the Jewish scriptures, the New Testament. For most denominations, it has 27 canonical books, 4 Gospels, Acts of the Apostles, a narrative about the development of Christianity after the death of Jesus, 21 letters by or at least attributed to important early Christian leaders, and the book of Revelation, an account of the end times. There were debates about including some of these books in the canon, such as James, Jude, and 3 John, and about some that were ultimately not included, such as several Gospels other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, several other acts of individual apostles, as well as letters purported to be by some of them. an apocalyptic work, Shepherd of Hermas, and the Didache, teaching. The opening lines of the work give its full title, The Teaching of the Lord by the 12 Apostles to the Nations, a late 1st century or early 2nd century manual of Christian belief and practice. The books of the New Testament were written over a much shorter period than those of the Hebrew Bible and the Apocrypha. Scholars agree that the earliest are some of the letters of Paul, written in the late 40s and 50s CE, and the latest is 2 Peter, written no later than 150 CE. So the books that eventually made up the New Testament were all written within a century or so after the death of Jesus, which occurred about 30 CE. The two parts of the Christian Bible are familiarly known as the Old Testament, an archaic rendering of Old Covenant, and the New Testament, New Covenant, terminology used at least since the late 2nd century, and based on Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 31 and Hebrews chapter 8 verses 8 through 13. Many scholars prefer not to use the term Old Testament because it is implicitly derogatory toward Judaism, and use Hebrew Bible instead. Why is the Protestant Old Testament different from that of Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians? Because of Martin Luther. In his classic translation of the Bible into German, completed in 1534, Luther placed the books known as the Apocrypha after the Old Testament, as a kind of appendix, stating that these books, while not having the same authority as sacred scripture, are still useful and good to read. He did so for two reasons. First, they were, as far as he knew, written in Greek rather than in Hebrew or Aramaic, and were therefore, in his view, less authentic. Second, several passages in them seemed to support Roman Catholic doctrines that he had rejected, such as purgatory and the importance of good works. The result is that the Protestant canon of the Old Testament and the Jewish canon, the Tanakh, have the same books, but in a somewhat different order. And while traditionally the Jewish canon has 24 books, the Protestant canon has 39, counting Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles as 2 books each, Ezra and Nehemiah as separate books, and each of the minor prophets as a separate book. However, many modern Protestant study Bibles do include the Apocrypha in a separate section between the Old Testament and the New Testament. 2. Languages, texts, and translations. What languages was the Bible written in? The Bible was written in 3 languages. The first is Hebrew, which was the primary language of the ancient Israelites for most of the biblical period, until Aramaic gradually replaced it. Hebrew continued to be used by Jews for scholarship and in worship, so that its status became something like that of Latin in the Roman Catholic Church. In a remarkable revival in the late 19th century, however, Hebrew became the preferred language of Jews who had immigrated to the Promised Land in Ottoman Palestine, and since then it has become a complex living language, spoken not only by Israelis, but by many Jews worldwide. Almost all of the Hebrew Bible is in Hebrew, and many of the Apocrypha were also originally written in Hebrew. Aramaic, a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew, was originally the language of several kingdoms in Aram, roughly the same as modern Syria. Those kingdoms were conquered by the Assyrians from northern Mesopotamia in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, and Aramaic became the lingua franca of the Assyrian Empire and its successor, the Persian Empire. Aramaic texts have been found as far east as Afghanistan and Pakistan, and as far west as Greece. In what had been the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, Aramaic gradually replaced Hebrew as the dominant spoken language. In the Gospels, Jesus is quoted as using Aramaic on several occasions. In the Hebrew Bible, Ezra chapter 4 verse 8 through chapter 6 verse 18, and Daniel chapter 2 verse 4 through chapter 7 verse 28 are in Aramaic, as are Jeremiah chapter 10 verse 11, and 2 words in Genesis chapter 31 verse 47, quoting Jacob's Aramean uncle Laban. The presence of these Aramaic parts is why the frequently used term Hebrew Bible is not entirely accurate. Several of the Apocrypha were probably originally written in Aramaic as well. When the Greeks under Alexander the Great took over the Near East in the late 4th century BCE, Greek became the preferred language of the educated elite in the Near East, and remained so after the Romans took over the region in the 1st century BCE. Several of the books of the Apocrypha were written in Greek, as was the entire New Testament. Even Paul's letter to the Romans was written in Greek. Every educated Roman at that time was fluent in Greek. In addition to these three primary languages, there are occasional words in the Bible borrowed from other languages. Because the Persians, from what is now modern Iran, controlled much of the ancient Near East from the mid-6th to the late 4th centuries BCE, we find Persian words like paradise, meaning an enclosed garden, and satrap, a Persian official. In the later books of the Hebrew Bible there are also a few Greek words, and in the New Testament, which was written in Greek, a few originally Latin words, reflecting Roman control of the eastern Mediterranean lands. For more than 2,000 years, as more and more of its books became authoritative scripture, the Bible has been translated into the languages of people who did not know Hebrew and Aramaic, and eventually, for the Apocrypha and the New Testament, of people who did not know Greek. How many translations of the Bible are there? Since antiquity, the entire Bible has been translated into hundreds of languages. Some parts, especially the book of Psalms and the New Testament, have been translated into several thousand more. That work continues under the auspices of such groups as the United Bible Societies and the Wycliffe Bible Translators, which have also made significant contributions to the discipline of linguistics in the course of their work. What are the oldest translations of the Bible? The earliest translation of the Hebrew Bible was into Greek. It was produced in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE for Jews living in Egypt and in other Greek-speaking regions in the eastern Mediterranean who no longer understood the original Hebrew. It is called the Septuagint, from the Greek word for 70, so scholars often refer to it by the abbreviation LXX. So important was this translation that legends developed about how it was made. A 2nd century BCE source, the letter of Aristeas, reports that the king of Egypt, Ptolemy II, ruled 285 to 246, was collecting books for the royal library in Alexandria, his capital city. At the king's suggestion, his acquisitions librarian wrote to the high priest in Jerusalem, asking him to send 72 scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, to Alexandria to translate the Torah into Greek. The 72 scholars produced an accurate translation in 72 days, according to a later source, so accurate that although the translators worked independently, they produced identical versions, which could have happened only by divine inspiration. The Greek translation of the Torah was thus as authoritative as the original Hebrew. The rest of the Hebrew Bible was translated subsequently, along with other Jewish writings, and the Septuagint became the primary version of the Bible used by Greek-speaking Jews, including the writers of the New Testament. Its use by Jews declined, however, as Christians adopted the Septuagint as their primary text of the Old Testament. For Orthodox Christians, the Septuagint continues to be the authoritative version of the Old Testament. By the 2nd century BCE, translations of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic were also being made. Known as targums, which means translations, these became the standard translations used by many Jews beginning early in the Common Era, especially in Palestine and Babylonia. Related to the Targums is the Peshitta, a translation of the Jewish scriptures and of the New Testament into Syriac, an Aramaic dialect dating to the 2nd century CE. Another very important ancient translation is the Vulgate. Completed in 405 CE, it was a translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Apocrypha, and the New Testament into Latin by the great scholar Jerome. The Vulgate became the principal text of the Bible for the Roman Catholic Church and is still used in official Vatican documents. How do translators work? Beginning with the Septuagint, most translations have been made by committees. Scholars usually divide up the books to be translated, and then the different versions are edited for consistency of approach and style. Translations of the entire Bible by individuals are less frequent. Notable examples are Jerome and Martin Luther. In the modern period, James Moffat, Franz Rosenzweig, and Martin Buber, and Edgar J. Goodspeed. And more recently, Everett Fox, Robert Alter, and John Goldingay. Whether working together or individually, translators have to decide on their approach. The two extremes are literal translation and dynamic equivalence. What is a literal translation? A literal translation, often called formal equivalence, is one that almost on a word-for-word basis attempts to produce a version as close as possible to the original. The biblical languages, especially Hebrew and Aramaic, are very different in structure and in syntax from English. For example, the opening of Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," has only 4 words in Hebrew. Another issue is style. For example, Ephesians chapter 1 verses 3 through 14 is a single, very long sentence in the original Greek, but few translators have tried to reproduce this precisely. Moreover, an overly literal translation can result in some awkwardness. Here are 2 recent literal translations of the first 3 verses of the book of Genesis. At the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, when the earth was wild and waste, darkness over the face of ocean, rushing Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. When God began to create heaven and the earth then was welter and waste and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Both have the advantage of making the familiar seem fresh, but neither, to my mind, is exactly elegant English, even though the original is elegant Hebrew. A literal translation can have advantages. For example, the Hebrew verb meaning to know does refer to what we might call intellectual knowledge and understanding. Sometimes, however, it is used as euphemism for sexual intercourse, to know in the biblical sense. So we are told that after they had been expelled from the Garden of Eden, Adam knew his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. See Genesis chapter 4, verse 1. Literal translations use the English verb to know in this verse. Less literal translations interpret it correctly as had intercourse with. But such a translation means that readers may miss the nuance of the verb elsewhere, as when, speaking through the prophet Amos, God says to Israel, "You only have I known of all the nations of the earth." See Amos chapter 3, verse 2, alluding to the frequent metaphor of Israel as the deity's wife. What is dynamic equivalence? At the other end of the translation spectrum is dynamic equivalence, also referred to as functional equivalence, which attempts to express the meaning of the original text in the target language. At its most extreme, this amounts to paraphrase, as in the rendering in the contemporary English version of Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, as Adam and Eve had a son. Sometimes, too, a dynamic equivalence translation will substitute a culturally appropriate sense for the actual meaning by, for example, rendering the phrase "white as snow," see Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, as "white as egret feathers," or "very, very white," in a translation for a culture that has no direct experience of snow. What is textual criticism? Another issue facing translators is what exactly to translate. As is true for most ancient literature, We no longer have the original works that the biblical writers and editors produced. Rather, what we have are copies of copies of copies, most of which date centuries after the works themselves were written. All of these copies are manuscripts, painstaking.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?